Welcome all. We have already some 230 people and much more interest in this event, which we're very excited about. People have been saying in the chat that they're coming in from all over the country. And we're very excited to have this forum to start to discuss how we can build a response and really send the right into the dustbin of history where they belong. So without further ado, I just want to thank our co-sponsors, Socialist Alternative, the Boston Revolutionary Socialists, High Peaks Chapter of Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA Afro-Socialists and Socialists of Color Caucus, Madison Chapter of DSA, New Politics Magazine, Puntorojo, and United Against Racism. Before I introduce our speakers, just a few brief community agreements. I just want to remind people that we want to keep it to one mic, so I'll recognize anybody who would like to speak. There's going to be plenty of time for discussion after our speakers go, so just hold tight and be prepared for us to call on you. I want to encourage comradely discussion and debate. Definitely, we would like people to feel free to raise disagreements, but let's keep them comradely. No disrespect or discrimination on the basis of race, gender, sexuality, nationality, religion, or ability. And we have a security team in place. Hopefully their job will be extremely easy and we can make them unnecessary today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, David McNally. David is the Cullen Distinguished Professor of History and Business at the University of Houston and Editor-in-Chief of Spectre magazine. David, welcome. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Haley. Thank you to everybody who has come in today. Thank you to Tempest magazine and to my co-speakers. I must say that Tempest has been a real breath of fresh air at a challenging and important time for the left, not only in the United States, but internationally. So I wanted to start really my comments by situating the rise of the right and the challenges for the left in relationship to two cycles. One of those is an economic cycle with respect to accumulation in the world capitalist economy. And the second is a set of political cycles having to do with composition and decomposition of the right and the left. So let me start with the economic cycle. Everything we're talking about right now is massively colored by the global slump of 2008 and 9. It was a transformative moment in world economy and world politics because it represented the end of the neoliberal economic boom. It was an inflection point when 25 years of economic expansion coming out of the recession of 1980-81, 25 years of expansion came to a glaring, grinding, crashing halt. And since then, for the decade that's ensued, we have essentially been stumbling through successive kinds of crises within the world economy, but also economics leading to all kinds of political ruptures and transformations. So that we have seen since the Great Recession of 2008-9, we've seen an insurgence of social movements on the left, Occupy, the movement of the squares that swept so much of Europe, particularly countries like Spain and Turkey, the Arab Spring, the insurgence of Black Lives Matter, the international women's strikes, Chicago teachers' strikes, and what in the first issue of Spectre Journal I referred to as the return of the mass strike, particularly in countries like Chile, Colombia, France, India, and so on. But of course, there's also been thunder on the right. In the United States, most clearly manifest with the rise of the Tea Party, Trumpism, but also the alternative for Germany, which has pushed politics hard to the right in Germany, the so-called UKIP, which transformed into the Brexit Party in Britain, Golden Dawn in Greece, and so on. So we're really dealing, as I say, when we talk about this break in this cycle of capitalist accumulation, we're talking about an inflection point, a turning point in which we have seen certain kinds of resurgences on both the right and the left, and both sides of that political equation are also facing really significant challenges. The other thing I'd like to say before getting a little more specific and concrete about some of the tasks of the left is that I believe in the United States, none of this can be separated from what Michael Goldfield in his brilliant book has called the Southern Key. That is to say, Goldfield argues there that everything in terms of politics in the United States is entirely shaped by the defeat of militant multiracial unionism and socialism, particularly during the Cold War period. His book called The Southern Key, I think, beautifully articulates this, and he demonstrates that from the 1920s through the 1940s, there was, as I say, a militant interracial unionism that fought and beat back the KKK, registered Black voters for the vote, defeated white supremacist politicians, integrated jobs, stores, and restaurants, fought racial discrimination in housing, busing, and employment, and built dynamic multiracial fighting unions. That was a moment in which white supremacist politics could have been quite decisively broken. And the failure of those campaigns, which have to do both with the Cold War and, frankly, the failings of bureaucratic business unionism, has shaped US politics ever since. And I emphasize that because the Southern strategy has been so decisive to the Republican Party. And if you look at the majority of congressional votes against recognizing the electoral results, the majority came from the South. This is something that shapes US politics. And it's why I have a friendly disagreement with the statement from Salvage magazine around the elections, which to me, I think, downplays the way in which everything on the far right in the United States pivots on white supremacy, pivots on glorification of the Confederacy, and so on. So with that in mind, let me say something about confronting the right and the cycles politically that I'm talking about, because working class movements go through processes of decomposition when organizations are defeated, movements are pushed back, class consciousness declines, and neoliberalism centrally involved a decomposition of working class formations, not only in the United States, but around the world. But these will at different points open up possibilities of recomposition. And I believe that since around 2011, there have been a succession of halting movements towards recomposing working class struggle in the United States, but there's no guarantee that this will produce an upsurge or an upheaval in struggle. And this is going to be decisive because defeating the right is also about consciousness, momentum, and political morale. Just to put this very concretely, the left had rising morale from May 25th through to August of last year. That is to say, the left sees the political agenda in the Black Lives Matter uprising across the United States following the police execution of George Floyd in Minneapolis. We know that at least 15 million people took to the streets and maybe 26 million or more. We know that it happened in 1,500 cities and towns across the United States. In Texas, where I'm living and working, there were former Klan towns, I mean, literally Klan offices on Main Street that had demonstrations of 200 and 300 people, multiracial marches, 60,000 here in Houston, where I live, the largest demonstration of the left in decades. But That insurgency was deliberately and consciously demobilized for electoral reasons to shift towards the presidential campaign. And at the same time, the right was remobilized through that campaign because of Trumpism and the fact that it had street-based mobilizations. So, task number one for the left in this regard is to mobilize, to take the streets, workplaces, and communities away from the right with militant confrontational mobilizations, mass mobilizations, not small squads that go out to fight Nazis and white supremacists, but mass organization through community groups, unions, the socialist left, and so on. The speaker's notes asked us to say something about personal experiences. I will simply tell you, and I'm happy to come back to this, that I was actively involved in the early 1980s in movements that defeated, yes, an organizing drive by the Ku Klux Klan in Toronto and by a right-wing split from the Conservative Party called the Reform Party in the early 1990s. And I'm really happy to talk about that. But I want to take my last minute to say something about the supplementary fronts of fighting the right. Yes, we need to defeat them in the streets, workplaces, and communities, but we also need to have an overall anti-capitalist organizing strategy that shifts the ground politically, because our huge asset is that we actually have politics that can stop evictions. We actually have politics that can build strike action in workplaces around the COVID pandemic and safety at work. We have a vision of multiracial trade union and socialist organizing. And I think for all of us on the left right now, we cannot take our eyes off the Amazon union organizing drive in Bessemer, Alabama. This is going back into a historic working class and civil rights stronghold where up to 6,000 workers may win union rights. If that happens, the left needs to mobilize in solidarity in a huge campaign that could be another victory for multiracial unionism. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. That was really incredible framing for us to continue with. So I wanted to let folks know on the live stream, if you're coming in and joining us there, that we have currently 279 people on the call. So welcome to all of you, and welcome if you're joining us through the Facebook page. So I'm going to move on to our next speaker. I also didn't introduce myself. My name is Haley Pessin. I am part of the Tempest Collective and also part of DSA Afro Socialists. So Jeb Purucker is the co-chair of Santa Cruz DSA, and I'm going to hand it over to Jeb to continue.
Great. Thanks, Haley, and thanks to the organizers of the panel. I'm really excited about events like this happening. I think we need to get a strategic conversation going ASAP on this stuff. So something that I'm really shaken by with the events at the Capitol a few weeks ago is kind of the lack of organized, concerted response from the left. And this has me really worried as we are lurching into the Biden years. There's been a little flurry of writings. There have been some really good pieces of analysis, but there were no real mass counter demonstrations like David is talking about. And it isn't entirely clear to me that we're even buckling down in our organizations yet for the hard conversations we need to have about strategy and organization as we move into this new conjuncture. When the events of the Capitol happened, our chapter put out a series of theses meant as interventions into some of the responses that we were seeing nationally, both from mainstream media and from fellow socialists alike. And I think that there's a general sense here that the way that the events in Washington were being framed invoked narratives and easy historical analogies that would block the left's ability to put together a coherent strategic analysis of the actual balance of forces in play, and would ultimately channel our actions in a direction that would undermine an independent left and strengthen the center of the Democratic Party. This is precisely the opposite of what is needed to combat a rising far right, both inside and outside of the institutions of power. That can only be done by an organized left, galvanized around a project of advancing the self-organization and empowerment of the working class. I'm really hoping that our conversation later today can actually get into some of the nitty-gritty details of what that project looks like and how socialist organizations need to orient themselves to accommodate this in the coming months and years. But first, I want to say a few things about the kind of analytical and narrative interventions that I think are necessary to ground that conversation. So some of this is related to the theses and some kind of goes beyond it. One of the starting points here has to be taking really seriously the fluid situation that the contemporary right finds itself in. Reasoning by historical analogy is not of particular use here, I think. If the events in the Capitol can be seen as an important punctuation mark on the Trump years, I would say it has to be something like a semicolon, bringing an end to certain alliances, but not a full break with what went before, a remodulation, possibly into something worse. The split on the right that may result from this event is likely not to be one that generally orients national politics leftward, or at least not automatically so. We can imagine an emboldened and anti-institutional far right divided from their previous allies in the mainstream of the Republican Party, but this breakup may actually just serve to provide cover for the continued rightward movement of the Republicans, who will be able to hold to the policies of the Trump administration while more easily distancing themselves from the more riotous elements connected to Trump himself. Meanwhile, the Democrats will be eager to reach across the aisle to form a coalition with any Republican whose politics don't quite rise to the level of armed skirmishes in the rotunda. The result of this then could very easily be a rightward movement of both parties, as well as a massive growth of an extra parliamentary far right, possibly still loyal to Trump, though this isn't sure by any means. And in this shifting political landscape calls for symbolic acts of condemnation, whether from AOC or Mitch McConnell or whatever, again, are going to ring hollow, and the legislative path forward for progressive policy, I think, is decidedly narrowed here. So to get to the question of organizing against the right, this is where I think that how we frame our understanding of the events at the Capitol becomes crucial. The first place that I think we need to push back pretty hard is on framing this event as a coup. The importance is not like pedantic or definitional squabbling, but rather to recognize that the categories that we use to describe events like this have embedded within them both assumptions about the nature of the danger we face and prescriptions for how to get out of it. The coup framing is something that has been a leitmotif of liberal and establishment discourse about Trump from the very beginning, and it grounds a return to normalcy policies that we're seeing now. Thinking in terms of a coup has the effect of short-circuiting our strategic thinking in a number of ways. First, it leads to an emphasis on the exceptionality of Trump, on the discontinuity between the Trump right and the Republican Party. We miss the mycelial connections that have developed between different strands of far-right organizing and state power, mostly at local and state house levels. In short, thinking these events as a coup focuses our gaze upward on national figures, and we miss seeing the contemporary right and its messy complexity as a movement that straddles the line between institutional power and extra-institutional spaces. When it comes to a response, we're similarly led to imagine that holding powerful figures responsible is somehow adequate, and once done, the danger is more or less past. It isn't exactly that I'm against congressional efforts to hold people accountable, but we shouldn't confuse this with an actual strategy to confront the right and avert future danger. We must instead conceive of this danger in terms of how the meaning of this moment will be woven into future right organizing and how it will embolden and inspire future mobilizations and violence. Worse than that, I think that there's a very real possibility that much of the unity that failed to cohere around the disastrous Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville might now actually find a way to ground itself around narratives of a lost cause at the Capitol. Whether this happens, I think, is a pretty open question right now, but this is the sort of thing that we need to be organizing against. Another element that I think we need to grapple with is the way in which I think narratives about the relationship between the right and the state is rather simplistically handled in a lot of the discourse. in much of this, there's a tendency to kind of vacillate between either calling for greater state repression or else pointing to the state's complicity in the events, like the cops let this happen or something. I think that both of these frames get things wrong in some pretty crucial ways when we think about the question of what is to be done. The fact that the demonstrators made it into the Capitol was a result of a complex set of political choices in different parts of the state. And our thinking about this needs to have room for this complexity without reducing it to simple statements about how the police supported the protest. We need to recognize that as an institution, the police are relatively autonomous from the extra state elements of the white supremacist project. As such, they always have one eye on maintaining their own legitimacy. Understanding these distinctions and divisions is going to be crucial if we're going to have a strategic relationship to states and a correct understanding of the right. And we need to incorporate this into all of the discussions that we're having kind of in our organizing spaces. We need to always recognize that our enemy is not monolithic, but is riven with contradictions to be exploited. But one way that we should absolutely not take this is to enthusiastically get on board with calls for the state to increase its powers in order to decisively deal with the right. The impulse to condemn the Capitol events on the basis of law and order, a phrase that both Trump and Biden invoked on that day, needs to be resisted. We have to recognize law and order as a phrase that sooner or later will be used against us. So too should we oppose language of treason, sedition, patriotism, and terrorism in discussion of these events. All of these are what I think, following Frederick Jameson, we might call ideologies of the right. That is, concepts which will ultimately serve to justify the expansion of the repressive power of the state. So the theses that we put out ended with some calls for action within the DSA. And I think I want to put some of those out here for conversation too. First, I think as the largest and most organized force on the left in a generation, the DSA has a special role to play here. And I think that so far we've been somewhat derelict in our duty. The Trump years saw an enormous growth of the organization from 5 to almost 100,000 members. And much of this was due in part to high profile and generally successful electoral campaigns. But the explosive growth has allowed us to hold in suspension some important questions about a strategy to build socialism in the 21st century. As the new conjuncture clicks into view, I think we need to pose these questions very directly. We remain an organization overwhelmingly oriented at the national level towards elections and institutions which, for the time being, we will remain a minor partner. As the response to events at the Capitol indicate, I worry about tailing the Democrats, or worse, becoming something like a permanent loyal opposition within the Democratic Party that is newly recommitted to building alliances to its right. Meanwhile, everyone's lives are still getting markedly worse by the day, and the wreckage of history continues to pile up. This is fertile recruiting ground for the far right, and which is able to offer a totalizing, if paranoid, view of what's wrong and who's to blame. The thing that reverses this isn't going to be just getting the word out about how much better this piece or that piece of socialist legislation or progressive legislation will be for working folks. It isn't even going to be winning some of the policy priorities that recently sent out by the national DSA in their statement on how to fight the right. This isn't a dogmatic rejection of electoral work, but I have real concerns that when we address the strategic value of this work, we're trading in assumptions that raising awareness about this program gets us closer to actually simply raising awareness about our program gets us closer to actually having power, as though the problem is just that people haven't heard about how cool Medicare for all would be. And I worry that we're asking the wrong questions when it comes to assessing that power in the present strategic landscape. If our goal is to provide a compelling alternative to the growth of the right, every strategic decision needs to be calibrated to a single question that needs to be sort of a mantra in our organizing spaces. How does this increase the self-organization of the working class? This means that sooner or later we have to, groups like DSA will have to confront head-on the question of what a socialist organization is for in the first place. Is the primary task of our organization conceived in terms of advancing socialist policies, planning campaigns, either electoral work or not, around those policies, and then mobilizing to accomplish these goals? Or is the primary task one of advancing the militant self-organization of the working class? So far, we've deferred this question with a thoughtful both and, but I think as we move into the Biden years, something's going to have to give. And we're going to have to sort this out sooner rather than later. So I'll end there. And yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Again, that was Jeb Purucker from Santa Cruz DSA. Thank you so much for that. So our next speaker is going to be Justin Akers Chacón. Justin is an educator and union activist in the San Diego-Tijuana border region, a member of the Puntorojo editorial collective, and author of No One is Illegal, Radicals in the Barrio, and the forthcoming The Border Crossed Us, the case for opening the US-Mexico border. Justin, please take it away.
Thank you, Haley, and thanks to the Tempest Collective for inviting me to participate in this important forum. So I want to talk a little bit about the far right in the context of the US-Mexico border. And I'll start by saying that immigration, the issue of immigration and immigrant workers has been a central issue for US capitalism, and therefore the two capitalist parties really throughout the history, but I'm focusing here especially since the 1980s. Since then, US capital through the US state has radically restructured Mexico's economy through so-called free trade agreements. And these led to the largest episode of capital export from the US into Mexico at the time, and resulted in the largest out-migration, displacement and out-migration of people not at war, also at the time from Mexico to the United States. The largest out-migration in modern history. In the context of this neoliberal restructuring, US capital has increased its reliance upon the exploitation of migrants and workers, both in the subject countries. So for instance, much of Mexico's economy today is controlled directly or indirectly through by US capital and foreign capital, but also, of course, and therefore the border serves has a function of keeping that labor contained and maintaining wage differentials. And then, of course, when migrants cross the border, their super exploitation as disenfranchised labor in the US. So since 1986 in particular, the passage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which on the one hand produced a legalization, on the other hand produced criminalization, both parties have largely converged around the same narrative, which is the need to protect the border, the political construction of the external threat. And so both parties have played a significant role in really competing and trying to outcompete each other for who can build up the border militarization complex more, who can criminalize immigrants more effectively. And this has, put it in the international context, this has mirrored the expansion of the US military over this period of time in the context of the end of the Cold War and the projection of US military power or reinsertion of US military power into different parts of Latin America, the Middle East, East Asia, and Africa. So, since the early 1990s, we've seen both political parties play this role of criminalization, whether it's Clinton and the Democrats building the wall through Operation Gatekeeper in '94, to Clinton and the Democrats with Republican support expanding the deportation machine in the mid 1990s, eliminating welfare for immigrants in many cases, in most cases, with Bush after 9/11 creating DHS and ICE, with Obama and Biden starting the process of caging families, expanding ICE into all 50 states, and creating the largest sort of deportation apparatus that we've seen in US history. This has been the process. And so while not new, the building up of what I refer to as the migra state, this apparatus of migrant repression, lays a primary context for the most recent rise of the right. Starting with the formation of hundreds of anti-immigrant groups, specifically in the period of 2004 to 2006. The most prominent of these anti-immigrant organizations that developed in this period were called the Minutemen. So to put a little more political context behind the rise of this particular group, in the 2004 election, George Bush was running for re-election and focused the issue on immigration, on criminalization of migration. That was one of the campaign focal points. John Kerry actually ran to the right on the question of immigration and said that the Bush administration from 2000 to 2004 had not done enough to protect so-called ports of entry at the border and at the ports across the country in the context of the war on terror. And so when Bush was reelected, Bush expanded the border wall from 100 to 600 miles of actual border wall structure. And this culminated with the passage of, in 2005, of what was called the Sensenbrenner-King Bill, which would have made it a federal, it would have made it a felony to be undocumented in the United States. So here's the context of the rise of the Minutemen. They were, like a pre-Proud Boy formation of largely petty bourgeois professionals, especially those being sort of crushed by capitalist globalization and the outsourcing of jobs, small and mid-sized business owners, et cetera. These forces, using the platform of national politics, began to organize quickly around the country. And in the context of where I'm at in San Diego-Tijuana region, they began to organize these staged sort of forays to hunt migrants, especially in the eastern part of San Diego County, with guns and things like that, to show the need for the border wall to be built. And so we organized against them. Starting in 2005, we began to use the organizational capacity that we had through organizations like the ISO, the International Socialist Organization, in San Diego and Los Angeles, but united with a number of other organizations to build regional mobilizations to the border to actually confront and disrupt these armed hunts. And this picture behind me is a picture of us actually confronting one of the Minutemen right at the border in a place called Campo, which is about an hour east of San Diego. And so we mobilized to disrupt their actions. We had about 150 people. They had about 40. We went everywhere they went. At one point, we surrounded them inside a VFW hall and wouldn't let them leave for over an hour. The police had to come rescue them. At night, they would try to sneak out and go on these hunts, and we would organize squads to go out and to follow them. And we had different tactics, from yelling to playing loud music on boom boxes, anything we could do to basically thwart their efforts. And in the end, they left very angrily without having any success. And the media, which was there to give them a platform, basically reported on how frustrated they were and how successful we were. One more example that extended into the next few months was they tried to organize another sort of regional march. They kind of copied our tactic to bring people from different cities into another border town called Calexico, about an hour and a half east of San Diego. And we did the same. We out-organized them. We brought about 200 to 250 people. We went into the town before their staged march to call for a border wall. And we did organizing in the community. We met with local organizations. We built a lot of solidarity in the community, and there was so much support for us and so much opposition to this planned march that they were going to hold in the town, that the mayor actually felt compelled to come out and say, "We don't want you here to the Minutemen. We don't want you to come to our town." And said that basically they're not going to allow them to march. We didn't accept that at its word. We organized anyways. We showed up. We had about, like I said, about 250 people. The Minutemen left before we got there, and we marched through the town. So I'm sharing these examples because these were key efforts that we tried to organize to ensure that they would not have a platform, that they would not be able to recruit, that they would not be able to harm any migrant people who they happen to come into contact with in their border. Their efforts to create these hunts. And they didn't go away. They changed tactics. They started to attack farm worker sites in North San Diego, literally attacked them, tearing up their tents and their personal belongings, because many of them were so poor they lived in, or underpaid, they lived in canyons around the farmlands in North San Diego County. So we would organize worker defense committees to go counter protest and confront the Minutemen doing this. And we would also send worker defense committees to Home Depots because they would go and try to intimidate day laborers. So the conclusion of our efforts locally was that we played a role in sort of demobilizing and out-organizing the Minutemen, and that played a role in pushing local politics to the left. So for instance, we had there's a small town south of San Diego that's predominantly Mexican called National City, and we actually were able to meet with the mayor, and the mayor established National City as a sanctuary city as a result of our ongoing efforts and in collaboration with the immigrant rights movement that was developing at the time. So, but most importantly was the mass movement of immigrant workers themselves in 2006. One of the most important uprisings of labor in modern U.S. history that effectively killed the Sensenbrenner bill. It pushed, like the Black Lives Matter movement did, but in 2006, it pushed politics to the left. The Minutemen fell off the map. The organizing was severely weakened, and everybody felt that the election of the 2006 election, which the Democrats won control of the House, and then in 2008, when the Democrats won both houses of Congress and the presidency, everybody believed that legalization was on the table. Of course, it wasn't. But that mass movement, that period of mass movement in 2006, just completely marginalized the far right. And I would just conclude that part, and I'm almost done here. Anyways, I have to conclude with this part. So the last thing I want to share is how things have changed since Trump. During Trump, the traditional anti-immigrant right regrouped, but now with neo-Nazis, Proud Boys, and with the direct support of elements of the San Diego Sheriff's Department. The local San Diego Sheriff and the DA were pro-Trump. And in 2017, they tried to reorganize a series of pro-wall rallies. And even though the police had publicly announced that they would create safe protest zones between those who were pro-wall and anti-wall, they actually played a direct role in allowing a group of neo-Nazis to attack pro-immigrant, anti-wall protesters, including myself. This was in December of 2017. We had about 30 people to protest the local far-right pro-Trump politician who was calling for the wall. And in the middle of the counter-protest, a line of sheriffs actually allowed neo-Nazis to cross their lines into our side and violently attack, injuring several people. Waited about 3 minutes, and then began to move and separate and allow the neo-Nazis to move directly past their lines. We were on the verge of being arrested. We were literally chased out by the sheriffs and the police department, who followed us out of the area for about 3 miles in a caravan of about 20 police cars behind ours. And then despite the video evidence of everything captured, from all angles, the sheriff's own investigation basically concluded that nothing illegal happened. And the local DA, who was openly aligned with the sheriff, refused to press any charges. So the opposition to the border wall, in this case, fizzled out in large part because of the threat of the general strike of airline workers in 2019 when Trump led the shutdown. And so the border wall protests fizzled out again, but the far right has become bigger in San Diego County, much more organized, and has direct support in the local police departments. And so organized mobilization and confrontation is going to continue to be urgently needed, especially in the months to come as we see immigration becoming a central issue again.
All right, thank you so much, Justin, especially for the inspiring examples of fighting back. I think that will be great to hear from others as well in the discussion if people have examples of that kind of experience. So our final speaker is Elizabeth. You know what, Elizabeth, I don't even know how to pronounce your last name. I apologize.
Lalasz.
Lalasz, okay. Elizabeth Lalasz is a registered nurse, a steward with National Nurses United, a member of Chicago DSA Labor Branch, and a member of the Tempest Collective. Elizabeth, go right ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Haley, and thank you to the Tempest Collective, all the co-sponsors, and for everyone for who's here today to participate in this really, I think, a critical discussion at this juncture. And so I'm going to talk.
Answer the question.
I'm going to talk about the role of the labor movement. I know that was touched upon, and fighting the far right in our workplaces. So obviously, this is a period of recomposition, as Dave McNally talked about, and I think I want to sketch out some of the dynamics of it, but the potential that's out there, especially after a year of a pandemic, and what that's actually done to workers' consciousness in the labor movement and the union movement. So just to talk briefly, and then what struggle looks like even beyond in general in the Biden era. So I'm going to conclude with that, and hopefully that'll spur some good discussion as well. Unions are one of the only effective working class institutions in this country that can engage workers to both build power in their jobs, but also in society at large. And that's what we're really pushing for. That's something that the union movement hasn't done a whole lot of, but I feel like this summer showed what the potential was like, with unions taking up the Black Lives Matter issues and really trying to amplify them. I'll get to that in a little bit, but obviously around the far right is another issue in which unions can play a critical role in pushing back on the right in the streets, but also within our workplaces. And this last year has been extremely difficult for working people in this country. I'm a nurse. I'm what they call an essential worker. I've been in my workplace for the last 11, 12 months. I've been organizing, and a lot of essential workers have been. And, we've seen firsthand what the pandemic has done. We've seen firsthand what the economy has done to people. We've seen firsthand what the inaction of a national government run by Trump and all his cronies has really done. And a lot of people have gotten sick. A lot of people have died. A lot of people have actually become unemployed. And there was really no plan. But workers themselves, both union and non-union, have also fought for safety, against layoffs, for hazard pay, and some have won some really fantastic victories. I won't say it's wholesale, but really I think those victories are important. And it's not just about the unionization rate or the number of strikes. Those are low. I'm being honest with you, and it's been that way for a while. But it's about what the pandemic has revealed to working people. Like I said, not just about Trump, but also about the capitalist system that we live under. And that's that for us, for me, and other essential workers, that, we found out that our employers in this system, the reality is they don't care about our lives. You can see that with the reopening of schools, that, school districts and their employers just don't care about teachers, and that they want to maintain the economy and their profits. And so that's sort of the bigger picture on one side of what's been going on during the pandemic. But the other side, I'll be honest with you, is another factor in the labor movement, which is, although, Trump has thankfully left the White House, good riddance, about 40% of union members actually voted for him in the last election. And that's pretty alarming when you think about where are your class interests? Your class interests are actually with what people I just described, fighting for better workplaces, for each other, relying on each other. And, part of that obviously is that the Democrats don't present an alternative, haven't for the last couple of presidential elections. And they're more concerned about bipartisanship than actually accomplishing what people want, what their real interests are, healthcare for all, funding for schools, cut the military budget, things like that. And it speaks to the deepening. This vote is also likely a reflection of Trump supporters, but also shows who is part of the far right. Is likely concentrated amongst people within police unions, firefighter unions, along with skilled trades, Teamsters, auto workers, steel workers, for example, not wholesale, but it reflects a section of the labor movement which adhere to or are sympathetic to the far right ideology, which was on display in the Capitol in Washington, D.C. during the riot, or whatever we want to call it, but it was pretty obvious. And, it's antithetical to the union movement, I believe, overall, and its politics, which are one of solidarity, an injury to one is an injury to all. It's, the politics of racism, misogyny, anti-LGBTQIA, anti-left. And, it really is something that the labor movement really needs to take on as a battleground as it's recomposing and rebuilding itself during I think what's a politically and economically very volatile time. This economy is the worst in a century. And so the idea of actually what we need to do to fight for what we need, I think, which is a pitched battle, really. It really is about that, is that, unions will become a major arena for anti-fascist organizing, not only to push back the far-right forces within our ranks, but also to organize openly in opposition to them when they organize in the streets and try to intimidate people. They try to go into Black neighborhoods, anywhere to try to actually take them on. And I feel like unionized workers and the labor movement are effective force against that. And even if it's a little bit quieter now, I've heard that, there wasn't actually any sort of rally at the Capitol. It wasn't even quite possible. I believe that those in Congress, on social media, will play on the economic fears over the coming months and the shortcomings of the Biden administration combined with racism to build their base. And we have to be ready to take them on in the labor movement. I think, luckily, that consciousness around the issues that were revealed at the Capitol, the real inequality and how people were treated during the summer, during the Black Lives Matter movement versus how the protesters in the Capitol were treated, it stood out to people. I have coworkers who are women of color. I work in a public hospital. They're like, we would have been shot dead if we would have actually gone into the Capitol. And these guys basically got, to use a phrase, carte blanche, come on in, and they stood there for hours. They weren't moved for hours, and that would never have happened to us. So, and these are also people who, I'll say in Chicago, and I know this happened in other places. For example, the head of the FOP here in Chicago, the Fraternal Order of Police, John Cadazzari, defended the Capitol rioters. And now there's actually a move to get him fired. He isn't the only one, but to use him here, my coworkers who, again, women of color, were torn on the issue of whether or not to support the police versus looters during, the uprisings around BLM at the beginning because of people's frustration around what was going on with the shooting of George Floyd. They were actually for the police going in and stopping looters. They've changed. They're like, some of them, I won't say wholesale, but it's significant at an anecdotal level. But, you think about what this means. They're actually for John Cadazzari being fired. They're like, we should do this. We should get away with this guy. This guy clearly is somebody who supports the far right, and they would have definitely treated us differently. So the call for the police, and then I think it also resurrects but it puts more urgency on the idea of, during the summer, there were calls by unions to get rid of the police in the labor movement. And that call needs to actually come back again. I'm not saying that there aren't dynamics. I appreciate what Jeb said from Santa Cruz. There are dynamics of the police, but I also think it's a call for people to begin to think about what that means and bring that back. And to also build on the actions that some unions did during the summer around the Black Lives Matter movement, which is bus drivers refusing to transport police in Minneapolis, arresting protesters in New York after the murder of George Floyd. On Juneteenth, went along the West Coast. I know about this, that the ILWU, the dock workers, shut down the docks in support of Juneteenth, and the professional sports teams who refused to play, Milwaukee Bucks being the first, but it was a ripple effect after Jake Blake was shot in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So, I think it's important for us to open up discussions within our unions with coworkers at membership meetings, as we did in some unions around Black Lives Matter, these are the places to argue for why we need to mobilize union members to oppose the far right. And then also, I think, and I agree with what people are saying, it's important to have discussions about why we can't look to the Biden administration to deal with the far right, to punish them or enact legislation against them, because it can be used back against us. I was just this past week in a discussion in my union, citywide meeting of nurses across Chicago, where we talked about this. And we said, if Biden enacts a Patriot Act 2, something similar to that, to repress the far right, we know it will be used against us. We already see what happened in Hunts Point Produce Market in New York, where the police came out to the picket line. That's outrageous. And it's just the beginning. And, again, with an economy as bad as it is, there are going to be more fightbacks. There are going to be more strikes. And this gets to my last point, and I'll wrap up with this. I'm looking for my timer, but I think we have to also then build resistance that's independent of the Biden administration or the Democrats. I get that people have a lot of hope. After 4 years of Trump and the last year in a pandemic with him being in charge, people want something different. And there's a lot being tied onto Biden. He signed a lot of, gotten rid of what Trump has, put into place and overturned that, gotten rid of the National Labor Relations Board head, that sort of stuff. But I don't think that we should have illusions in what that actually means. And the only way we're going to be able to win things as working people and in the labor movement is if we actually organize ourselves. There are a lot of contract expirations that are coming up over the next year. Hundreds of thousands of workers, healthcare workers, municipal workers, state workers, school employees. Labor Notes has a good article on that. It is going to increase. Those are going to be the pressure points of around collective fight back on the part of union workers. And our employers are going to claim poverty. They don't want to give it to us. And it's not only about a budget and money, it's about power. So it's about that fight. And so we have to connect the fight against the far right to these actual fightbacks for collective, for what we need to survive in this pandemic. And I'll just end with this, which is really about the experience in Chicago about Democrats and we have a big fight that's on our hands that people should know about with the reopening of schools in the Chicago Teachers Union. The mayor is a Democrat, Lori Lightfoot. She is a neoliberal Democrat. She's a Black lesbian mayor. She ran on a progressive platform, and then she has actually reneged on most of it. And the teachers union is the biggest, group of workers in this city who oppose her. They want to strike in 2019, and now she's trying to force the schools back open. Tomorrow was supposed to be the date. And the teachers union, led by the rank and file, actually have been refusing to go inside the buildings, teaching outside. They have had their remote learning. They've tried to continue it. They've been cut off, been locked out. And so they just took a vote over the weekend to have the entire union actually remain remote as of tomorrow. And if they are retaliated against, that they would go on strike in the old fashioned way with picket lines. That kind of stuff is, and apparently I just got word that Lightfoot and CPS, the Chicago Public Schools, have backed off. They don't actually want the schools to open until Wednesday. So that's the kind of power we talk about. And the role of socialists and socialist politics has been absolutely essential in that fight back. There are socialists within the union who actually argue about the power of the rank and file, the power of confrontation, in the sense not confront, of actual organizing ourselves to take this on and not be forced back into unsafe buildings. I know that gets slightly off the far right, but I think these things are connected in how we have to be seeing the world, fighting the far right and also fighting, the capitalist system, which is going to be pushing back hard against us and the Democrats to get what we need to survive and to build